Look around you right now. There's a good chance you're reading this through it. A window, a screen, a pair of glasses, a camera lens somewhere nearby. It's so ordinary that your brain has stopped registering it as anything at all. And that's exactly the problem, because this one material rewired almost everything humans know about the universe and about themselves. It let us see bacteria before anyone believed they existed. It let us see craters on the moon before anyone believed the moon had any. Kings went to war over its secrets. Master craftsmen were locked on an island and threatened with assassination if they ever tried to leave. And somehow, after 4,500 years, scientists still can't agree on whether it's a solid or something stranger. This is glass, and its story starts with a bolt of lightning. Long before any human touched it, the Earth was already making glass on its own. Lightning striking sand fuses it into brittle, hollow tubes called fulgurites. Volcanoes cool into obsidian, a black volcanic glass with an edge sharper than surgical steel. Stone Age toolmakers prized it and traded chunks of it across hundreds of miles long before anyone had built a city. In a very real sense, nature handed humans their first scalpel, fully formed, out of fire. Deliberate human-made glass shows up around 4,500 years ago, somewhere between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Nobody recorded the moment it happened, but centuries later, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder offered an explanation anyway. Phoenician traders cooking on a beach propped their pots on blocks of natron because there were no stones handy. The heat fused the natron with the sand beneath it, and a strange molten liquid ran out and hardened into glass. It's a wonderful story. It's almost certainly not what actually happened, but the underlying chemistry checks out completely. Melt sand, soda and lime together at extreme heat and you get glass. For a long stretch after that, glass stayed a luxury item, not a household one. Egyptian and Mesopotamian craftsmen shaped small vessels by hand-forming molten glass around a core of clay and dung, a process that could eat up days of skilled labor for a single bottle. Recipes were guarded like state secrets, and finished glass ingots were shipped and traded across the Mediterranean like precious metal. Even Tutankhamun's tomb held proof of how prized glass could be, a scarab carved from a strange yellow-green glass that hadn't been made by any furnace at all. It had formed in the desert when a meteor slammed into the sand millions of years earlier. Pharaohs, it turns out, were collecting glass that fell from space. Then, around 2,000 years ago, somewhere near Syria or Palestine, an anonymous craftsman changed the material's entire trajectory. He discovered that a gob of molten glass gathered on the end of a hollow iron pipe could be inflated with a single breath and shaped in seconds. Glassblowing had arrived, and it detonated the old economics of the craft. Work that used to take days now took minutes. Prices collapsed. For the first time in history, an ordinary Roman household could own glass. Cups, jars, bottles, all mass-produced across the empire. Wine, oil, perfume, and medicine traveled the Roman world sealed inside it. Rome also gave glass its next big job: windows. Roman panes were thick, cloudy, and small, but the concept itself was radical, a wall that let daylight through. And Roman thinkers were already circling something bigger. The philosopher Seneca noticed that letters looked larger when viewed through a glass globe filled with water. The lens was sitting right there, waiting. It would take 1,000 more years for anyone to pick it up. When Rome fell, glass-making knowledge in the West went quiet for a while, but in the East, it never stopped. Baghdad, Damascus, and Cairo became the new centers of the craft, producing enameled and gilded glass of extraordinary quality. Around the year 1000, the scholar Ibn al-Haytham studied exactly how light bends through curved glass, laying down the mathematical groundwork of optics itself. His writing on the subject would eventually be translated into Latin and shape European science for centuries afterward. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, glass found religion. The Gothic cathedrals of the 12th and 13th centuries were essentially stone skeletons built to hold up walls of coloured light. At Chartres, at Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, entire scenes from scripture were told in glowing red and blue glass, readable to peasants who couldn't read a single word of text. Craftsmen guarded their colour formulas as family secrets. Gold produced the deep ruby tones, cobalt produced the blues, and pilgrims travelled for days just to stand inside that coloured light. For a while, glass wasn't a scientific instrument at all. It was proof of heaven. But its real power was still coming, and it would rise out of one very unlikely place: a city built on a lagoon. By the late Middle Ages, Venice had turned glassmaking into a monopoly worth killing for. Venetian workshops produced cristallo, glass so clear it looks less like a material and more like solidified air. European royalty paid fortunes for it, and the Republic knew precisely what it had. In 1291, the Venetian government ordered every glass furnace in the city relocated to a single island, Murano. The official reason was fire safety. The real reason was control. On Murano, glassmakers could be watched, and their formulas could be locked away with them. In exchange, they were given real privileges: the right to carry a sword, the right for their daughters to marry into noble families. But one rule was absolute: they could never leave the Republic. A glassmaker who fled with Venetian secrets was committing treason, and the punishment escalated fast. First, his family could be imprisoned. If that didn't bring him home, Venice sent people after him. Several defectors turned up dead in foreign cities, their techniques dying with them. Even that wasn't enough to keep the secret contained forever. In the 1660s, King Louis XIV wanted mirrors for Versailles, enormous ones, and Venice controlled the only workshops that could make them. His minister Colbert simply bribed several Venetian mirror makers to defect to Paris. Venice was furious, and shortly afterward, 2 of those defectors died suddenly and mysteriously in France. Poison was the obvious suspicion. The survivors begged to go home, but it no longer mattered. The knowledge had already crossed the border. The workshop the French built became the Royal Mirror Works, the ancestor of a company called Saint-Gobain that still exists today. In 1684, France unveiled the payoff: the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, 357 mirrors lining a single golden gallery, and a very public message that Venice's monopoly was finished. While kings were fighting over mirrors, glass was quietly preparing its most important trick yet: giving humanity new eyes. Sometime in the late 1200s, somewhere in northern Italy, an unknown craftsman ground 2 small lentil-shaped discs of glass and set them into a frame that could sit on the bridge of a nose. Spectacles had just been invented, and their impact is genuinely hard to overstate. Before this, a scholar's or a scribe's career effectively ended once his eyesight failed, often by his 40s. Spectacles doubled the working lifespan of nearly every literate mind in Europe. Then, in the 1450s, Gutenberg's printing press flooded the continent with small printed text, and demand for spectacles exploded. Lens grinding turned into a common trade almost overnight, and once a society is full of people who know how to grind and align lenses, somebody eventually starts experimenting with stacking them. In 1608, a Dutch spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey applied for a patent on a device that made distant objects look close by, lining up 2 lenses. He called it a looker. We call it a telescope. His patent was rejected. The idea was already spreading too fast to control, and within a year, word of it reached a mathematics professor in Padua named Galileo Galilei. Galileo never even saw Lippershey's original. He heard a description, understood the principle, and built a better version himself. Then he pointed it at the sky, and what he found broke 2,000 years of settled belief. The moon, supposedly a perfect heavenly sphere, was covered in mountains and craters. Jupiter had 4 moons of its own, orbiting it in plain view night after night. Venus went through phases exactly like the moon, which only made sense if Venus orbited the sun. And if Venus did, the tidy old picture with Earth at the center of everything didn't hold up either. 2 pieces of shaped glass had just knocked humanity out of the center of the universe. The church put Galileo on trial and forced him to recant. It didn't matter. Once you've looked through the lens, you can't unsee what's on the other side. While the telescope was busy reordering the heavens, another arrangement of glass was about to expose an entirely different hidden world, the impossibly small one. In the Dutch city of Delft, a cloth merchant named Antony van Leeuwenhoek ground tiny lenses as a hobby, some no larger than a fingernail but powerful enough to magnify objects hundreds of times over. In the 1670s, he pointed one at an ordinary drop of pond water and found it was crowded with movement. Thousands of tiny creatures spinning, swimming, multiplying. He called them animalcules. He had just discovered microorganisms, an entire living universe hiding in a single drop of water, and the scientists of London's Royal Society initially refused to believe him. The glass, of course, didn't lie. 2 centuries later, this invisible world would turn out to be the source of most human disease and the foundation of germ theory, vaccines, and modern medicine itself. Glass had now shown humanity the infinite and the invisible, and it kept working quietly in the background of nearly every scientific breakthrough that followed. Thermometers, barometers, flasks, test tubes. Chemistry itself is barely possible without transparent, heat-resistant glassware you can actually watch a reaction happen inside of. Even something as personal as the mirror changed how people understood themselves. For most of history, mirrors were dim, polished metal. Clear Venetian glass mirrors gave ordinary people, for the first time, an honest look at their own face, and some historians tie that shift directly to the rise of portraiture and the modern sense of the individual. The Industrial Age then multiplied glass past anything earlier centuries could have imagined. New furnaces turned window glass from a luxury into a commodity. And in 1851, Britain built the Crystal Palace almost entirely from glass and iron, nearly 1 million square feet of it, glittering like an Industrial Age cathedral. In the 1820s, the French physicist Augustin Fresnel designed a stepped lens that could throw a lighthouse beam more than 12 miles out across open water, a piece of engineering credited with saving countless ships. But industrial glass also had a brutal underside. In bottle factories across Europe and America, boys as young as 8 worked overnight shifts beside roaring furnaces. Then, in 1903, an American engineer named Michael Owens, who had started in the same factories at age 10, perfected an automatic bottle-making machine that could outproduce dozens of workers at once. Within 20 years, child labour in glass factories had effectively collapsed. A former child labourer had helped end the practice that once employed him. That same year, in a French laboratory, a chemist named Edouard Benedictus knocked a glass flask off a shelf and watched it crack without shattering. Residue from an old plastic solution had formed an invisible film inside the glass. He filed the discovery away until newspaper stories about motorists disfigured by shattered windshields jogged his memory. Laminated safety glass followed, and it has been saving lives on roads ever since. Around the same period, Corning developed a glass that could survive violent temperature swings, Pyrex, which conquered kitchens and laboratories alike. And laboratory-grade glass would soon carry an even heavier responsibility. Nearly every vaccine on Earth still travels the world inside small vials of tough, borosilicate glass. Glass kept reaching further outward too. In 1990, humanity launched a telescope into orbit, built around a polished glass mirror roughly 2.5 meters wide. The Hubble Space Telescope, direct descendant of Galileo's little tube of lenses, has since shown us galaxies being born and dying billions of light years away. And in 1970, researchers at Corning perfected optical fiber, glass drawn into strands so pure that light can travel through them for miles without fading. The purity involved is almost absurd. Ocean water this clear would let you see straight to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Today, hundreds of thousands of miles of glass fiber sit on the ocean floor, carrying nearly everything you send online as pulses of light through threads thinner than a human hair. And then it ended up in your pocket. In 2007, as Apple prepared to launch the iPhone, Steve Jobs demanded a screen made of glass instead of plastic, despite nothing on the market being tough enough for the job. Corning delivered an experimental hardened glass within months. It became known as Gorilla Glass, and today more than 8 billion devices worldwide are built around some version of it. Glass is even quietly powering the next energy transition. Nearly every solar panel is, at its core, a sheet of weather-hardened glass with silicon sandwiched inside, converting sunlight, the same material once revealed the true nature of. So here's where 4,500 years of history actually lands. The material that showed Galileo the moons of Jupiter, that showed Leeuwenhoek a universe living inside a raindrop, that was worth killing for on a lagoon in Venice, is the same material sitting in your pocket right now, carrying your messages across the ocean floor as light. And after all that, physicists still can't fully agree on what glass even is. It isn't a true solid. It isn't a liquid either. Its atoms are frozen in the middle of moving, disorder captured mid-motion, like something interrupted before it could decide what to become. The substance that taught humans how to see everything else remains, even now, one of the hardest things to see clearly for what it actually is.